Let me start by welcoming this very distinguished panel to discuss some of the outcomes of this research project and its impact on various things. But let me start with the way which I hate to do, to apologize. And I apologize for my problems with my eyesight. I have difficulty seeing and recognizing people. So I have next to me Hilary Kaminer, who's going to help me identify people. But the panel, as you know, consists of Georgina Ferry, Richard Hollingham, from whom we've heard already, Professor Martin Campbell-Kelly, sitting on my left, Professor John Agar, and Professor Tony Bryant, who's been working with us in various ways. First thing, let me introduce myself. I'm Frank Land. Some of you have seen bits of me in the various films and things today. I was strictly second generation Leo. The first generation were the ones who worked at ANZAC. I came when Lyons were trawling through their offices to find somebody, to find people who would be happy to join this new team of computers in the computer business, of which we knew nothing. None of us knew, had an inkling about it. About a dozen people, I think, were selected to go to the course, and of those, 2 survived. One of them was Mary Blood, later Mary Coombs, whose obituary you probably saw in the national press. It was in just virtually every paper. And the other one was myself. And we were duly chosen to join the Leo team. Learning programming, learning systems analysis, and working in various capacities, but mainly programming and designing systems for Leo. And I was one of those. And I stayed with Leo myself for 16 years, finishing up with the title of chief consultant. So that was my history. After 16 years, I went back to my own alma mater, the London School of Economics, and became their first, and I think the first professor of systems analysis in this country. So that's my story. But we now want to start with your story and your connection to Leo, and then perhaps go on to think, what has this project, which we've been hearing about this morning, what has this project done? What value does it produce? How important is the history of that period to what we need to know now, and what our younger people and children need to know, what we need to learn about, for whom computers are not just something very special, but an absolutely everyday thing. They don't think about computers, they think about their mobile phone, they think about their laptops and whatever, and their tablets, but they don't think of it the way we thought of it, as a very strange thing. If you meet somebody now, there's a reasonable chance he actually works in some capacity with computers. In our days, if you said computers, they thought you meant somebody, a person who does calculations. Not that at all. So that's my story. Now I wonder if we can start with Georgina and something of her story and something of her connection to Leo, and then go around the panel, each one of us, saying some of that. Thank you.
Thanks.
So can we start with Georgina?
Thank you very much, Frank. So I'm a science writer, I started years and years and years ago working for New Scientist magazine, and I've been a freelance writer most of my career, working both in print and radio broadcasting. I'm mainly specialized in writing about molecular biology, so you could very well ask, what am I doing here? The answer is that the first book I wrote was a biography of Britain's only female science Nobel Prize winner, Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin. She was an X-ray crystallographer. X-ray crystallography was one of the first scientific fields in which computing made an absolutely enormous difference to the way complex biological molecules could be analysed. And indeed, the EDSAC computer, which Frank mentioned, was one of those. That was one of the uses to which Cambridge University put it when it was first built. Oxford was a bit behind, which is where Dorothy Hodgkin was, and so it needed to buy a computer. And Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin chaired the committee that looked into what computer they were going to buy. They didn't buy a Leo, they bought a Ferranti, but they clearly considered Leo because when I was researching my biography, I went through all the archives, a wonderfully kept archive of her papers, and found 2 sheets of foolscap, another term that we don't use very much anymore, about the development of Leo. And I thought, this is the most extraordinary story. Nobody knows about this. I should write a book about it. I then very quickly discovered there were already 2 books about it that I hadn't known about. One was edited by David Cameron and colleagues. The other was by Peter Bird, who is the Lyon's historian. But I got them out of the library and looked at them, and I thought, well, I think there's still scope for a more popular account that can be read very, very widely by people who have no background in either business or computing, because I saw the story as an opportunity really to discuss the social history of work in Britain in a way. This was a machine that was taking on the clerical work that was being done by lots and lots and lots of young people. And that transition as something that has really changed all our lives. And I thought there was a broader context in which the story could be told. So I wrote that book, and it came out in 2003, I think it was, originally. And as Frank has kindly mentioned to 1 or 2 people, it did become a Radio 4 Book of the Week, which I was very, very pleased about. And since then, I seem to have been adopted by the Leo Computer Society, which is lovely, because they are the most wonderful group of people. And I've been to several reunions. I've been to other events. I've taken part in various little films. And sadly, because I'm getting towards the end of my career now, and one of the little jobs that keeps me ticking over is writing obituaries for The Guardian, and I've ended up, I'm sad to say, writing obituaries for a couple of the Leo hands, including Mary Coombs and Peter Herman. I think that's... yes, I've also done articles for the Dictionary of National Biography on some of the senior Leo figures. So I think that pretty much gets me up to date. I'm on the mailing list, so I keep up with what Leo's been doing, and I haven't had anything to do with this project at all, I should hasten to say, but I had some initial conversations with Hilary about the film, but I think the work that's been done here is absolutely fantastic, and look forward to discussing it some more.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Who's next?
Richard.
Now Richard, please. We've heard from Richard already today, but in a slightly different context. Yes,
So hello.
Maybe not so different.
So hello, I'm Richard Hollingham again. Yeah. Your book did help the film, because I read your book and it really helped the film. I'm in the process of adoption by the Society. So it's quite a long drawn out process, but I think we'll get there. We'll get there eventually. So I'm a science writer and broadcaster. With my wife, we run a company called Boffin Media. So we make the things we do on a weekly basis. We make a current affairs programme for BBC World Service. I write for the BBC Future website. And in fact, the latest story I've just written is quite a lot on the Apollo guidance computer. I write a lot on space. I've done a lot of space. I used to do commentaries for the European Space Agency. So when you saw Tim Peake going to space, I was the commentator on that. And my background, I was a senior producer on the Today programme. My original degree is actually in applied biology, but I've always been a journalist, a science journalist. I'm mainly specialising in space and the environment. But I have always been fascinated with computers. And I've pitched so many programmes that haven't been made on the history of computers over the years. I was lucky enough to study a course at the University of Michigan University on history of computing. What's quite interesting in the States, and this was about 15 years ago now, in the States, the history of computers is told in a very different way, from a very American perspective. And it's just looking around the museum here and getting to know the Leo story, just how different the British story is. And then, of course, they sort of merge together. And I did come across the Leo computer earlier, but when the opportunity came up to do this, it's just been fantastic to be involved in this, to get to know some of the people involved. And I've always seen this, like you were talking about the social history, I've always seen this as a people story rather than a hardware story. You can get sucked into the hardware and how these things work, and there are lots of people that do, and that's fine. But for a general audience, I don't think that's the story. I think the story is, like Frank saying, he's in a room full of, clerks, getting very, very highly educated clerks, getting very, very bored, doing lots of calculations. Yes. And then along comes, this computer, this technology. And what's so fascinating about Leo, you had these, like EDSAC and these other research computers, that it was a computer that I think one of the biggest connections to computers today, just as, this thing rarely fails me, it's really reliable in its own way. That's the genius of Leo, that it was a reliable computer that was reliable enough to do things like payroll and the sort of calculations.
It had to be reliable.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the amazing thing about Leo. But I think the story we tried to tell in the film, and I think what's so fascinating about the project is the people.
Yeah. One interesting point you made is when you looked at history of computing, which you had done in Michigan and so on, Leo wasn't even a footnote.
Yes, I know. And I think, so just to add one more thing, I think what's great about now, I know you mentioned about, that we take computers for granted. And I take AI for granted. I use AI to help me write features now. I use AI to sort of bounce ideas off. So when I was writing a story on the Apollo missions, what they did for us, I asked the AI, what should I include in the story? And I use that as the base, it's a really good way of helping me. We use AI software, as I mentioned, for the transcription. So we take this stuff for granted. I can't remember what my point was. But Leo was a footnote. I don't think it is anymore. And I think thanks to these sorts of projects, thanks to these sorts of, centres like this, thanks to the work at Bletchley Park, I think there is so much more appreciation now, and thanks to Georgina's book, so much more appreciation now of Leo than there was 10, 20 years ago. So I think there is an understanding and appreciation, and it's such a great way into computers, Leo, because if you can understand how Leo works, you can understand how a smartphone works.
Thank you. Martin.
I'm Martin.
Campbell-Kelly.
Hello, I'm Martin Campbell-Kelly. I've been an academic historian of computing really since the 1970s. Yes. An historian rather narrowly defined, I suppose, in the context of computing and the computer industry. How I got into that was when I graduated towards the end of the 1960s. I have a very distinct memory. I was revising for my finals, and I was getting a book down off the library shelf, and I found this book called The Preparation Programs for a Digital Computer, often known as Wilkes, Wheeler and Gill, which was the book about programming the EDSAC computer. and I was in the middle of doing my finals, so I put it back on the shelf thinking, one day I'll go back to that. And that moment arrived about 5 years later, in the mid-70s, when I was employed by Sunderland Polytechnic as a lecturer, and they were trying to upgrade the credentials of their academics, and they offered, if you registered for a higher degree, they would give you a day off a week to do it. So I took that offer and met up with Brian Randall, who was at Newcastle University, and he supervised me. And the project I wanted to do really was leading off from the EDSAC programming system and to try and find out how this new technology of computer programming, which was sort of unknown really before the invention of the computer, how that diffused in Britain. So the information then was very fragmented. It was actually quite close to the events. I mean, we were talking about the 1950s, and I was doing this in the 1970s, so it was not so far on. So there were people to talk to, but there were no archives at all. But occasionally people would loan me documents. So one of the machines, there are about 10 machines I had to look at, was the Leo. And I was helped by David Kaminer and John Pinkerton, who engaged in correspondence with me as I was trying to unravel it. And the thing that crept out of me was this was the only computer I knew of at the time that was actually designed for business and not for scientific computation, which was a remarkable thing. There was actually one other computer, and that was the UNIVAC computer in America, which was exactly, again, it was the same type of people who had a mission for doing actual business calculations rather than scientific calculations on the computer. So that really made the Leo quite unique. And that led me to sort of inquire, what kind of programming, in what way was it different to scientific programming? And it was illuminating because one of the research students, David Wheeler, and one of the co-authors of the book I mentioned, spent a summer vacation, I think in 1948, mapping out a payroll program for how would Leo do payroll.
Yes.
And the interesting thing, it came to 1,700 orders. Now, the EDSAC, as it was originally envisaged, had room for about 500 or at most 1,000 orders. So already that first decision had to be made that the memory actually needed to be about 4 times bigger than had been planned for the EDSAC, because commercial programming for business is really quite different to programming for science. I was also interested to find when it actually ran business programs as opposed to scientific computations, because the Leo, it was initially used, the peripheral equipment wasn't available for a while, so it was actually being used essentially for statistical and scientific computations, really from its inauguration until about 1953, when it got fully switched onto commercial work. But it turned out, and this information was given me by David Kaminer, that the first job it ran was the bakery sales evaluation in September 1951. So I think pretty sure that does make it literally the first program that was ever run for a commercial application as we would understand it. And by late 1953, it was doing the payroll for the entire Lyon's company. Just one thing, a matter of terminology is worth clearing up, because I think that the Leo people made a great decision at the Leo Society when they said it's the first business computer, because a term that's often used is the first commercial computer. And by that, it's an ambiguous term. Sometimes they mean a computer designed for commerce, and sometimes they mean a machine that was commercially manufactured. So in that sense, the first commercial computer is usually argued to be the Ferranti Mark I computer. Or you could probably go to the UNIVAC in the United States, which appeared the following month. But they were commercially manufactured computers. And this is something different. It was a business computer.
Great.
Thank you very much. And now?
John Agar. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm John Agar. I'm a historian of modern science and technology. I work at University College London now. I've been there since 2007. And I think you can't understand the modern world without understanding science and technology, and to understand how we got to where we are and where we might be going in the future, you need to understand how change happens and how science and technology is part of that. And historians absolutely depend on reliable sources, documents, and talking to people who know what they're talking about. And I know we're going to talk a little bit later about why it's been so important to keep the collections of Leo. And so I'll come back to, I think, to talk about why I'm so pleased that there's an organisation like the museum here and the collections they have here and the work that's been done with the Heritage Lottery Fund to make that even more accessible and well known and well preserved. But a little bit, just to go back to why perhaps why I'm sitting up here. Well, back in the early 1990s, I had just finished a PhD in the history of science. I'd originally done mathematics, but I'd got really interested in the history of science, partly because it's such an amazingly broad subject, and in the sciences you end up being specialised. I always wanted to keep that very broad view of the world and how it works and how it changes. And history of science and technology seemed to be a fantastic subject for doing that. And I'd done a PhD on the history of radio astronomy, which got me into the history of Manchester and Manchester University. And I think that's probably why I ended up in 1994 with my first job, which was as a lecturer in history of science and technology at the University of Manchester. And part of my job there was looking after a computing archive. So I was teaching the students about history of science, history of technology, and some history of computing as well. But part of my job was to look after this computing archive. And that had some Leo material. It had quite a lot of ICL material, which of course includes Leo material. It's part of that package, that huge archive that rather arbitrarily got split up, and some of it ended up at the Science Museum, but some of it ended up in Manchester. So I was always, talking to people about history of computing and bringing people in to look at collections and trying to make sure those collections were understood and working with people. And I think it must have been in the mid-1990s that the Leo Computer Society got in touch. And it might have been Peter, I can't remember exactly who it was initially, but I ended up being invited down to a Leo reunion. And I think it was one of the ones that was held in London, possibly the Armoury Hall. Does that make sense?
Royal Artillery Company. Honourable.
The Honourable
Artillery
Company. That's it. Got it. That's exactly right. And I met this fantastic bunch of people who had clearly not only were a community that were part of the developing Leo and Leo's history, and as that went through ICL, but had kept their own identity as well, in quite a unique way, I have to say. There are very few other parts of the history of business or technology that has kept that sense of community and memory. And the books that have come out of, like the ones that Georgina mentioned, I think are an expression of that. It's also, to be honest, it enables us why we're here today. And there's something unique in that community, in that memory, keeping that story going, telling that story, that's been so
think my voice is gone, but you can hear me. That is so important. Anyway, I was deeply amazed, I think, by the warmth of the welcome. For me, I was a very young academic, but I met. I remember meeting lots of people who had been working at Lyons and on Leo, and it was a sort of one of my first sort of true links with, I think, the whole community who worked in computing. So I was always very impressed and thankful for that, actually. I think it probably energized my wish to work on history of computing. So for a few years, that was perhaps my main subject. So I wrote a book called The Government Machine, which looked at the introduction of both punch card and computing machinery into offices, particularly government offices. So not just Leo machines, but other machines too. But that was part of the story, is how and why did that change how we work? Right? So how did computerization, computerization, back then, not a particular popular story for historians to be interested in, but how did that change, what bureaucracies could do, what offices could do, what organizations could do, what governments could do? So it's part of that story of why computing really matters. So I'll stop there. But that was my connection with Leo. It's back. I haven't really done much on the history of computing for a few years now. But in the 1990s, I was delighted to make that connection with the Leo Society.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, Tony Bryan, please.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Tony Bryan. I am Professor of Informatics at Leeds Beckett University. Before I went into academic work, I was working in software in the 80s. Actually, I'm really a sociologist and social historian. And I have sort of three links with early computing in this country. The most profound one is through Frank with Leo. I've known Frank for probably more than 25 years, and I've always been keen on listening to his fascinating accounts of the early history of Leo, his idea. When he went to LSE, I think he had half a day a week to run the computers at LSE, one man half a day a week. Like others here, I've been adopted by the Leo group, but I've also been active with Frank in his passion for making sure we capture the history of Leo. We co-edited a couple of issues of one big journal on IS history. In fact, Martin, I think, was one of the contributors to that. Frank and I also have had a very long conversation, which has been published in a couple of parts. It's been a real joy to work with Frank on this important project and to see the fruition as it's come here today. My other link is through working with Steve Shirley over the last few years on her company, F International. If Richard wants to pitch an idea about a TV program about that, I have a fascinating group of women who I interviewed over the last couple of years and then did a presentation to Steve and them in August last year to celebrate 60 years of F International. A key aspect. It's lovely to see her picture up here as well. My third link is a somewhat trivial one, which was around 50 years ago. He was my squash partner, Herman Hauser. He was a PhD. I was an undergraduate. He was, I think, a postdoc even by then, doing work on structural engineering and so on. Like everyone in computing, they always drift in from other subjects. So that's a slightly trivial link, but quite a meaningful one as well.
I think that's...
Thank you, Tony. I wonder if we could now turn to ask what this particular project, whose ending we are celebrating today, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, very generously, finishes today, held up a little by the COVID pandemic. What do you think yourselves has achieved for society as a whole, for today's youth who hold their mobiles, use computers every day, and society as a whole? We can always talk about the benefits for academia. It provides always good material for academia, and the academics love to discuss things like that. But what is its use in the wider sense? What did we get from this? What particular things would you pick out as the highlights of the project whose ending we are celebrating today? Can we do it in turn, or would somebody like to volunteer an answer?
I'll volunteer a short answer.
Right.
I would volunteer a short answer that actually I don't think it's ending today. I think it's actually, this is the start of it. So the video, the film, for example, is out there. It's 11,000 views, but we could get a lot more than that. And I'd like to see it gain that. It's not going to date anytime soon. But more significantly, the 3D, the project, the amazing visualization of Leo, that's yet to be launched on an app. And once that's out there, I think there's lots of potential for that to become, for so many more people to see that. Yes. So I also think it's the start of people being much more familiar with Leo and its significance, and also like I was saying, the importance of computing in the UK as well, and the UK's role in global computing. Yeah. Which I was quite heartened when I was on a Zoom call with you the other day, that there was someone from the Museum of Computing History in Silicon Valley on the call, who was aware of Leo, had a Leo display, and we were talking about how can we get the film out there. They're the sort of people it needs to be pushed out globally. So that's why I would disagree with you. I think it's the start, not the end.
Anyway.
Yeah, can I jump in? I mean, one of my favourite quotes is the past isn't dead, it's not even past. And I think the whole point is that what we're seeing, when we talk about museums, I think of things as sort of, musty places you wander around where things get pushed away and forgotten in dusty archives and so on. I suspect the median age of the people in this building today is probably several decades above what it normally is, because you probably have normally school children and so on. And I agree with Richard. I think this is actually the point at which you're developing something which is going to become a living aspect to people. They may not understand it in the same way. It's very difficult for, I teach students in their teens and early 20s, and I try and get them to think about what it might have been like not to have computers. And I know friends of mine who have young children, and as soon as they see anything on a screen, a TV screen or even a window display, they start doing that because they assume touch screens are universal, and they're quite surprised when they don't respond. It's very difficult. I think, we've reached certain watershed points. I think 2007 was a watershed point when the first smartphone comes in, because it's got social media and everything comes together. I think November 2022 might be another watershed moment because of AI chatbots and ChatGPT, which is certainly everyone in education is scratching their heads thinking, how do we make sure students actually do some work rather than using ChatGPT. I did actually try ChatGPT to write a Bob Dylan song about Leo, and it was it was appalling. It really was. So there are still limitations.
As expected.
Well, no, I like Bob Dylan songs, but anyway, it didn't work. But the point is, I think it is. I agree with Richard. This is the beginning of something, and I think it's really terrific. And I think the film and the animation is just incredible.
Yeah, I think I want to go back to something Richard said about the story being about people. Yeah. And I think what this project has done is, it's layers upon layers, really. It's told a story about the origins of the Leo computer, which was something that was only achieved because of an incredible collaboration between among a very small team of people who had a definite goal in mind. And that goal wasn't to make lots of money. The goal was to make a machine that worked reliably, and would help the business that they worked for, Lyons, achieve its aims more efficiently. Although I don't think that was what was in their mind. I mean, I had this sense all the time that they were driven just by sheer perfectionism, by wanting to make something that really worked, that they could be proud of. And then I think on top of that, this project has layered a group of archivists and historians and members of the Lyon Computer Society who have that same ardent dedication to producing something that's as good as it can be. And I think both the film and the virtual reality realization of Lyon 1 are extraordinary examples of that. And you have a sense, yes, there was a budget, but the people who made these things, it seems to me, went way beyond what they were being paid to do.
It's minimum wage, basically.
It's been done with love, and that's not a word you hear bandied about in the IT industry very much these days. And I think if the message of this project is this is what you can achieve if you work with a team of people with a common goal and care about how good it is at the end, then that will be a very good outcome.
I wonder if
Well, one of the realities of an archivist's life is that you can't keep everything. And you rely in a way on serendipity to bring materials that are relevant. And the fact that a lot is destroyed and doesn't end up in archives. Otherwise, the world would be 2 foot deep in paper. But also, you do want archives that are complete. So there's a kind of contradiction here. In other words, you don't want an archive for every computer that ever was built in great completeness because it's unsustainable. But how valuable it is that the Lyon archive is very, very complete. And actually, if you wanted to look at the life story of a typical computer, well, it's somewhat atypical, this would be the place to look. Usually when we go to archives, you'll find there are tantalizing missing bits and pieces because there are not the resources to go out and hunt for them. But of course, what's happened with the Lyon archive is that people have actually gone out and hunted for them. So you actually have a remarkably complete collection. I don't think there's anything like it in the world. But I've been to the University of Pennsylvania to see their archives for the ENIAC computer, and they're nothing like as complete as we have here. They're sort of the accidents of history that sort of eventually arrive at an archive. They were never systematically collected, and this really has been systematically assembled.
I'm glad you said that, because that's what I wanted to say. For me, one of the very important things of this project is the collection of material. And you can't do history without that material. It's an essential part. If you say that the history is of value, then it must be supported by the evidence. And that's very much what this project has produced in large amounts, and it's producing, looking forward all the time. At the moment, material is always dropping from the cloud. And I ask all of you here, if you have anything in your cupboards, or anything, because that's where much of the stuff is, let us know about it. It doesn't have to be about Leo. It can be about other companies which built these early computers. But it has to be.
Thanks, Frank. I'm just going to pick up on a point that Frank was making about how important it is to have the evidence to make these collections.
Yeah.
And as Martin says, with the Leo case, you can unusually complete group of documents and other artifacts to tell that story. And I think, as I said, that's partly, I think, because of the unusual sociability of the Leo society. We have then a question, or a couple of thoughts, really. One is, why might it be important to have that kind of evidence, especially looking forward? Well, historians, they point to evidence to make their arguments. Otherwise, they're just making things up, right? And so we need to have secure, well-held, preserved archives, documents, objects to be able to tell story, to interpret the past reliably and to reinterpret the past, because that always happens as well. And that's important because we're asking, I think, really important questions. Why is the world as it is? What is the role of technological change in producing the world around us? How does it relate to culture and politics and other things? So we want to be able to tell those stories, but we certainly need well-preserved archives. And bear in mind that we are going to be facing, in the near future, a tsunami of made-up stuff, right? Precisely because of the ChatGPTs. The price of producing what looks like reliable information has dropped to almost nothing, and this is going to create a problem for deciding what's a good source and what isn't. And unless there's good archives that can keep the good stuff away from the bad stuff, we're going to be completely swamped by misinformation of various kinds. And if you add to that the possibility of faking documents visually, right? Imagine asking a sort of visual chat GPT, produce me a document that says the Americans actually made Leo. It could do that, right? So we're facing a problem of reliability of sources, and therefore the underpinnings of our interpretation of the past. And that matters for the stories we tell about the future, because going back to why do you want to keep telling the Leo story? It's because the Leo story is lots of things. It's a story of automation, and it's important to have a conversation about automation now, because we're heading into all kinds of different kinds of automation. It's a story of innovation and where it comes from. That's also not just a British story. We know that the Leo story partly starts with that visit to the United States to go and talk to people. Technology always comes from elsewhere, really. It's always in movement. It's always moving around. But being able to tell that story reliably means having to have the documents to do it. So places like this and other archives that collect it are extremely important. They have to keep on doing that to the highest of standards, and otherwise we're going to find that we won't be able to tell good versions of the past from bad versions of the past, and then we're all going to be in trouble.
And to support the kind of people like this museum who actually take that material, display it, find the right people to try to educate, bring the schools here to see what is happening and what happened, and always know why they're doing it. Not doing it for the sake of something in brackets education, but for something which has this important distinction between truth and falsehood. I wonder if anybody would like to add anything from the panel here, or should I ask the audience whether they have any particular questions from the panel? I think there's a question from over there, sir.
Hi, I'm Gary Chisholm. I'm Heritage Officer, one of them, with Northamptonshire Council, so we're based in Corby. And yes, Corby Steelworks had one of the early Leos. But our town generally doesn't know this. It's not really a story we tell. So my question to the panel and people present is, if it is a beginning, which is how I see it as well, how can the Leo Society Group support venues like Corby to share their story locally, your story locally? Are there any plans to be able to do that?
Would anybody like to answer that?
Well, I mean, I can't really speak on behalf of the Leo Society, but I will say you're welcome to the film.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the whole point. This stuff is out there and it's meant to be shared. It belongs to the Centre for Computing History and the Leo Society. And like we were talking about the other day on the Zoom call with, I'd love it shown in Silicon Valley. I would also love it shown in Corby. I think the thing I would love to have done, I could have made a 10-part documentary on this system. I would have loved to have done more on the Leo 2s and the Leo 3s. And I would have loved, it's just time. We were asked to make a 15-minute film. We made a 26-minute film. We probably couldn't really make a 10-part series. But there were so many stories around the Leo 2 and Leo 3. And there are probably some very good people in Corby still around. Almost certainly. It would be lovely, even if you could just capture their, their oral histories or get something, I know it's always about funding. But I'm sure the Leo Society would love to support any efforts to develop a display there or develop resources in Northamptonshire, because that is one of the ones I was aware of, definitely in Corby.
I think it's perhaps worth saying that the next Zoom forum is from Corby.
And is there any attempt to develop to present the history of the steelworks in Corby? I mean, is there a... Yes, so this should be part of that story.
I was just wondering if, the Leo Society itself was planning on any kind of touring exhibition or something that we could then start with, that we could use and then introduce and widen to the local story.
We'll write it down, isn't it?
I think it's worth saying that it's something we had in mind, but it does take a lot of resource, and we're all volunteers, but if we can get some more volunteers, as I asked for earlier, maybe we could do something like that. It's certainly worth doing, I agree.
Going forward, the project to me has left us with a vast amount which has been done, which has transformed in many ways our understanding of the Leo story, but which also leaves a vast amount of untold material, and we have to go on and keep collecting it. It doesn't end today, it starts today. I think that's the important lesson, one of the important lessons to me. I think we've all learned a vast amount from this project, and that what we have learned is of genuine value to society. At least we have to imagine that it's useful to society, that society won't reject us. There's always that danger.
Right, there's a gentleman there who wants to ask a question.
I will speak up rather than use the microphone. Patrick Blake's engineer. I will probably put this question, therefore, very badly. My memories of the 1950s are fading fast, but looking at the film, I think it was, I noticed several references to aptitude tests and the need to think logically. And it occurred to me that possibly the impact of computers has been much deeper than we appreciate. Because nowadays, everyone has to think logically, even if it's only the machines in our pocket. If you push the buttons in the wrong sequence,
which we do,
multifunction buttons, you get the wrong answer. In the 1950s, if we drove our car from here to Glasgow and back, if it misfired once, we thought nothing of it. If things go wrong now, once in a million times in your computer, it would fail every third of a second. Have we all started to think more and be more logical as a result of computing? Would the panel agree?
No. No, there's an awful lot of magical thinking still about, I'm afraid. You only need to go on social media to discover that logic doesn't govern the thinking of an awful lot of people. So it would be lovely to think that, we've probably got better at pushing buttons, but somehow that doesn't seem to have led to a new age of reason.
I agree that I think just thinking about how we do things. So in the film, I think it's Anne and Helen talk about the aptitude test of how to make a cup of tea and all the things you had to do in the process, which is a bit of its time because obviously now you just plonk a tea bag in a cup. But I'm thinking what we do and the way we work, everything we do, we have a logical workflow. You could almost, if I have to explain how we make a podcast to someone, a new producer, you have a very clear, I end up drawing a flowchart because that's what we do. And we all talk, within the BBC and everything, of what's our workflow? How do we do this? And it is a sense of logic. It is a sort of thing. It looks very similar to what you have to do, to program a Leo computer. And I think the AI, AI is it's fascinating of what's happening now with AI. I use AI. I use it for the transcription software, and it made something up the other day, but you can check it, you can edit it. I think we just have to give people credit for how you use it. It's like all technology. You could argue that, Leo and computers like Leo were used for missile trajectories and the like. You could argue that anything like this is used for good and for weapons or whatever. And I think with the AI, it's the way you use it. So I know this isn't answering your question, but in defense of AI, I use it to bounce ideas off. So, if I'm writing this article, what should I include? It comes up with a list and it gives me ideas for how I write the article. I wouldn't trust it to write an article though.
Well, how about our professors?
Well, I'm not quite sure that it is logical thinking. One of the things I do is for our local university of the third age, I help older people who are struggling with technology, struggling more than I am, I should say. And what you find is that it's actually familiarity with the technology, that it becomes internalized, particularly with young people who are sort of grown up with it. And using a smartphone is probably not dissimilar to using a car. You need to do a few thousand hours of training to get really adept at it. Young people do put in those hours, and old people don't. And it's quite hard to think your way through the processes that are involved, because the next steps only are obvious, intuitively obvious, if you're very experienced of using the technology. But it's quite fascinating to watch this going on. When I used to teach human-computer interaction, and one of the students I asked them was this idea of envisioning, which people used in product design, to imagine a scenario in which a product is being used. The one I used at the time was, imagine an older couple want to record a program on a video recorder, and they're just going out to the supermarket, and they suddenly realise they want to take this program while they're out. And people would come up with quite interesting scenarios, and I would always say, well, first they got to find their glasses. And then you've probably put the VCR on the floor, and they've got to stoop down to get to it. So all those sort of issues. Again, I think it's a very ripe subject, actually, for human-computer interaction. I'm not quite sure it's about logical thinking. I think it's about making interfaces more intuitive.
Yeah. Can I give my 2 pence? Based on, I've been Frank's student since I was an undergraduate in my second year at university.
So I think I know what Frank would say. And what he taught was not technical, not logical, socio-technical. And actually, what we've got are hybrids. They are a bit technical and a bit social. And when push comes to shove, probably the social overwhelms the technical. And so the idea that we absorb the logic of the machine, I think the machine absorbs the bizarre logic of us as human beings. So I think socio-technical is the answer, not logical technical. And I'm putting words into your mouth, Frank.
The word which we haven't heard particularly is values. And if you're thinking about these things, we have to think, are we supporting or do we have any values in going in one direction or another and taking one point of view or another point of view? And social technical thinking is one which is really about putting values into their place as the very important ingredient in the kind of actions we take, the kind of thinking we do. And I think we had the example this morning of the BBC interview, which seemed to be totally devoid of anything of that sort. I think, if there are no further questions, thank you very much for the audience, and I hope you enjoyed the session. Yeah.